Sand whipped relentlessly across the barren Wyoming plains as twilight bled into night. In the midst of this vast, indifferent wilderness stood a crude, half-collapsed homestead, a monument to a despair that had long haunted the land. Here, within a shallow patch of scorched earth and skeletal sagebrush, Lillian, a young woman in her mid-20s with determined, sorrowful eyes, struggled against the weight of injustice. Bound by the cruel decree of her own husband, a man driven by bitter pride and an obsession with paternal legacy, Lillian had been buried in the harsh desert up to her neck. The rough earth, unyielding as the unforgiving frontier itself, pressed in on her, while the cold gaze of the setting sun revealed every tear and every silent plea. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've got something extra special saved just for you. For Lillian, life had become a waking nightmare of neglect and cruelty. Her husband, consumed by his belief that her failure to bear a child was a curse upon his line, had chosen this terrible punishment as his final judgment. As she lay half submerged in the desert sand, her hands clawing weakly at the grains of earth that held her captive, a deep inner resolve stirred within her. Though pain and humiliation cut her like the bitter wind, she clung fiercely to the hope that even the darkest fate might yet yield a fragment of redemption. It was in those excruciating moments that fate, like a hidden current beneath a drought-stricken river, began to shift. On the horizon, a solitary figure emerged from the gathering darkness. A rider, his silhouette etched in the last vestiges of daylight. This was Preston, a widowed rancher of about 39 years, whose quiet presence and gentle bearing had long been the subject of quiet rumor among the few who knew his name. Having lost his own beloved wife to the hardships that ravaged the frontier, Preston now cared for his 4 children, bright, spirited souls who looked to him as both protector and guide. His heart, scarred by grief yet unyieldingly kind, pulsed with steady hope that transcended the loneliness of the Badlands. Preston's horse trotted steadily over the rough, uneven trail, kicking up small plumes of dust that glimmered like fading stars in the descending gloom. As he approached, his keen eyes fell upon a disturbing scene. A young woman, her body encased by the unforgiving desert, her eyes brimming with both despair and a resolute longing for freedom. Without a word, he dismounted with the practiced ease born of many long days spent tending his vast, rugged domain. The crunch of his spurs on the hard-packed earth seemed to shake the very silence that enveloped the accursed homestead. "Miss," he said gently, his voice low and steady, "are you all right?" There was no ridicule or scorn in his tone, only a deep, empathetic concern that spoke of personal loss and a determined will to help those cast aside. Lillian's eyes, wide with shock and mingled pain, shimmered under the faint light as she struggled to raise her head. She could barely form words, her throat parched and her spirit battered. Yet something in the seriousness of Preston's gaze, the resolute kindness that lay behind his weathered features, stirred in her a small but persistent glimmer of hope. With deliberate care, Preston knelt beside her, rolling back a tattered piece of cloth that had been meant to hide her humiliation. He grasped her arm and used his weight to pull her to a sitting position. The desert sand, a harsh companion to the sorrowful, shifted around them as he slowly excavated the earth that had been her prison. "Hold on," he murmured, his words soft as the wind that whispered through sagebrush. "I'm not going to let anyone treat you as less than you are." As Preston labored against the oppressive heat and stubborn earth, the landscape seemed to hold its breath. The stars overhead burned like distant promises, and the biting cold of the night juxtaposed the delicate warmth of his compassion. Bit by bit, his hands cleared away the coarse sand from around her face and neck, revealing the pallor of her skin, flushed with both cold and the first sparks of relief. In that tender act of rescue, the harsh lines of fate began to blur, transforming a moment of dehumanizing punishment into one of quiet salvation. Even as Preston supported Lillian to stand, the wind carried a sullen murmur from the distance, a cadence of hooves and low voices, as though warning that trouble was not far behind. The sound, soft and insistent, pulled at the edges of their brief reprieve. In that perilous moment, When the vast wilderness seemed poised between both cruelty and kindness, Lillian's heart pounded with both fear and an emboldened hope. Might this stranger be the one to shatter the chains of her suffering and lead her toward a new destiny? Preston, his eyes never leaving the darkened trail, spoke quietly. "I have 4 children waiting at the ranch. You're safe with me now, but we must move quickly." His words, simple and sincere, ignited a fragile determination in Lillian. Though her body ached from the indelible marks of her punishment, her spirit awakened to a new possibility. The promise of a chosen family, of a home where grief might transform into strength. The horizon offered no clear answer, only the lingering threat of unknown pursuers and a remnant of the cruelty she had just escaped. Yet as Preston helped Lillian towards his waiting carriage, a weather-beaten wagon drawn by a sturdy bay mare, the desert itself seemed to shift in its silence, as if the herald of future where hope, though tentative, was beginning to take root. At the edge of the homestead's crumbling boundary, with the wind carving silent odes through the sagebrush and the stars burning low in the sky like distant embers, a final, heart-rending note punctuated their departure. In the swirling darkness, intentional tracks marred the plain, a stark reminder that vengeance or retribution might still be lurking in the shadows. Before they could mount the wagon and flee toward the relative safety of Preston's ranch, a distant cry, barely audible yet laden with ominous weight, rippled across the chilling night. It was a sound that promised danger, a call that might yet shatter the fragile hope dawning in Lillian's eyes. As the carriage creaked to life and wheeled slowly away from the ruined homestead, Lillian clutched the scant remnants of her old life close to her heart. In that moment, burdened by the weight of injustice yet lifted by a newfound possibility, she silently vowed that the cruelty of the past would not dictate the promise of her future. The lonely, wild plains of Wyoming bore witness to her defiant spirit, and as the night gave way to an uncertain dawn, the path ahead shimmered with the fragile luminescence of hope and rebirth. And so, with the echo of that distant, haunting cry lingering in the air, their journey began, a journey filled with the quiet promise of redemption, the steady strength of chosen family, and the resolute hope that even in the harshest of deserts, one could still find a sanctuary to call home. The cry that had once shattered the twilight now subsided into a distant murmur as Clarissa's battered wagon creaked along a narrow, wind-beaten trail through the frost-rimmed canyons of Wyoming. The ghost of that night's terror had not vanished entirely, for every gust of wind still whispered reminders of the cruelty she had endured. Yet with each mile, the promise of safety grew nearer. Ahead lay the homestead of Charles, a rancher known to few in these parts for his quiet determination and for the small family he raised on a patch of rugged, yet enduring land. As the wagon's wheels spat out gusts of sandy dust that danced in the newborn light, Clarissa sat clutching a faded kerchief, her only remnant of the life once taken from her by a heartless decree. Her eyes, red-rimmed and solemn, reflected both the cruelty of her past and the fragile hope that now stirred within her. Beside her, a stout man with gentle eyes and face weathered by grief guided the wagon steadily onward. This was Charles, whose own past was etched in loss and quiet resilience. Though his face was lined with sorrow, his manner was reassuring, a silent promise that no cruelty could extinguish the spark of compassion within him. Upon reaching Charles's modest homestead, a cluster of patched wooden cabins and sturdy corrals encircled by sagebrush and pine-swayed knolls, the wagon slowed and came to a creaking stop at the rough-hewn gate. The homestead bore the marks of hard-won survival, a fence lovingly repaired with planks and twine, oil lamps that glowed softly at dusk, and a landscape that had been sculpted by both nature's fury and human determination. As the wagon's door swung open, Clarissa hesitated at the threshold. The very air here tasted of earth and hope, a stark contrast to the bitter dust of her ruined homestead. She gathered herself and stepped down, her trembling legs bending under memories of shame and abuse. Charles moved beside her with congenial care, extending a callous hand as though to steady not only her body, but her wounded spirit. Inside the main cabin, the atmosphere was simplicial yet profound. A single well-worn table, a crackling oil lamp, and a few cherished objects arranged with solemn pride. Here, a sense of chosen family filled the space. Awaiting their guests were Charles's 4 children, each a vivid reflection of life's capacity to endure against odds. At the back of the cabin, Irene, the eldest at 12, watched with keen, thoughtful eyes that spoke of maturity beyond her years. Near her, Walter, 10 and spirited, observed with a mixture of skepticism and budding empathy. 7-year-old Emily clutched a small rag doll, as if it were a talisman, while little George, just 5, gazed up at the newcomers with wide-eyed wonder. The children's quiet presence lent the room a gentle energy, and even as Clarissa's heart raced with mingled gratitude and trepidation, a subtle smile touched her lips at the sight of these fragile beacons of hope. For the first time in what felt like endless darkness, someone offered her a promise of a future. A life built not on the misery of the past, but on the hope of today. Charles ushered her to a rough wooden chair by the table and placed a tin cup filled with warm broth before her. "Take your time," he said in a voice that was both kind and measured. "We all have scars, and the road to healing is long. But here, you are welcome to rest." His words, simple and sincere, filled the room with a quiet assurance that made the cold edges of her recent torment soften. As Clarissa sipped the broth, her eyes wandered to a small, worn leather satchel resting near Charles's chair. Inside, almost hidden from view, lay a ragged bone-handled knife, a keepsake he sometimes used to recall a love and a loss that had once defined his world. Though he never spoke of it openly, the knife spoke volumes through its silent, enduring testament. In this harsh land, every soul carried its own weight, its own memory of grief, and its own capacity to rise again. Outside, the wind moaned against the walls like a lament. The rustic homestead, though offering shelter, was not free of its own dangers. As the morning advanced, clouds began to gather on the horizon, their dark bellies heralding the approach of an early spring storm, a reminder that nature, too, was as untamed and unpredictable as the human heart. Overhead, the pine-shadowed ridges stood silent and austere, their surfaces glittering with the remnants of frost. Amid these moments of tentative peace, a new sound rose, a sharp, insistent knock at the cabin door that reverberated in the stillness. The knock was sudden, its rhythm deliberate, and it cut through the tender lull of the homestead like a herald of impending crisis. Charles exchanged a wary glance with Irene, whose eyes widened in alarm at the unexpected intrusion. Before any answer could be given, a low murmur rippled through the assembled group, a hushed conversation that hinted at a disquiet among the locals. Some whispered that a trader, known for carrying tidings of regional unrest and unresolved land disputes, had been seen near the boundaries of Charles's claim, that a stranger might be coming not solely to offer news, but perhaps to stir hidden resentments and rivalries set an anxious tremor among them all. Hesitantly, Charles rose and moved to the door, his hand steady despite the tension in his gaze. "Who is it?" he called in a measured tone. The reply was muffled, a brief, almost apologetic. "It is I." Came back before a voice, low and gravelly, continued, "I bring word of a claim long disputed. You would do well to listen." The door swung open to reveal a thin, angular man with a weathered face cast in shadows. His eyes were sharp and probing, and he clutched a folded piece of paper as if it were a lifeline. His name, he said in a clipped tone, was Fletcher, a trader whose reputation in the outlying settlements was as ambiguous as the deserts themselves. "They say your land holds more than just soil," he remarked, glancing pointedly at the posture of Charles and then at Annabel, whose expression alternated between suspicion and fragile hope. "There are forces at work, and old wounds that bleed if left uncared for. I've come with a warning and an offer, if you are willing to hear it." His words sent a shiver through the room, stirring echoes of bygone feuds and whispered betrayals that had long plagued these rugged lands. Margaret, though still reeling from the horrors of her past, felt the faint stirrings of self-assertion. It was this moment, amidst uncertainty and the rumble of the approaching storm, that her will began to harden. She rose slowly from the worn chair, her gaze now fixed on the stranger with mixture of resolve and anxiety. "What is it that you know?" she asked in a voice that trembled only slightly, determined to uncover what secrets might yet shape her fragile future. Fletcher's eyes flickered, and he extended the folded paper toward her. "This document," he explained, "bears the mark of a rival claimant, a man who asserts that your land, and by extension, this refuge, belonged to him through an ancient right." His tone was both matter-of-fact and laden with insinuation. "I bring this not to sow discord, but so that you may prepare. There are those who would see you cast aside once more, if the winds of fate do not favor the resilient." Charles, his spirit fortified by years of enduring his own losses, stepped forward and took the paper with solemn care. His eyes skimmed the hastily written text, and a deep furrow creased his brow. "It appears," he murmured, "that the dispute over this land runs deeper than we realized." The words fell heavy in the quiet that followed, mingling with the low, mournful sound of storm beginning to gather force outside the cabin's walls. Inside, the group's initial relief at finding shelter was now thickened with the bitter taste of forewarning. Margaret's heart pounded as the weight of the past, of the cruel betrayal that had once condemned her, resurfaced in Fletcher's cryptic message. Yet the moment also carried a promise, one of chosen family and hard-won redemption, a community overcoming the cruelty of old feuds. Before anyone could speak further, the wind outside intensified, sending a cascade of rain against the windows and causing the outpost timbers to groan under nature's assault. In the flickering lamplight, faces gathered in anxious circles, and the murmur of voices became a low, unified caution. The rumbles of the impending storm merged with the sound of distant, persistent footsteps, clear proof that the threat was not yet past. Margaret's eyes locked with Charles's in a silent exchange of resolve and vulnerability. Together, they understood that this newcomer's warning might be the harbinger of a battle over land, of a final reckoning with the ghosts of injustice that had haunted her own tragic fate. "We must decide," Charles said slowly, his voice firm yet touched by the sorrow of his past losses, "if we will stand and fight for what we have built, or if we will be driven out by those who seek claims founded on bitter old grudges." At that agonizing moment, as the storm's roar grew louder and the paper's dire message lay heavy between them, an indescribable tension seized the outpost in a final, shattering beat. The sound of a determined knock, louder and more insistent than before, echoed again from the door, this time unmistakably close, as if the threat itself had come knocking. The outpost fell completely silent, every heart suspended between hope and dread. Margaret, with a trembling yet resolute gaze, tightened her grip on the small keepsake she had fashioned into a symbol of her resolve, a bone-handled knife passed down from a woman who had once dared to dream amidst despair. Outside, rain pummeled the earth in a relentless cadence, and the world seemed poised on the brink of another critical juncture. What emerged at the door? Would the threat deliver final judgment or a new promise? And as the turbulent Wyoming dawn edged closer, the future of this fragile, chosen family hung in the balance, poised between the merciless truths of the past and the shimmering possibility of redemption. The knock resounded again through the storm's fury, a sound that cut through the lashing rain and howling wind like a sharpened blade. In the dim light of a tin lantern, which barely held back the gloom in the common room of Nathaniel's homestead, Seraphine's heart pounded as its echo merged with the thunder. Now sheltered among patched timber walls and the steadfast presence of the rancher's family, she braced herself for what this second call might portend. Outside, the Wyoming Badlands raged under the onslaught of a relentless spring storm. Rain lashed the frost-crusted canyons, while wind moaned like mourning through the pine-swept ridges. Nathaniel, whose weathered face had borne witness to countless storms and sorrows, moved slowly to the door, his steps steady despite the chaos beyond. His 4 children, Beauregard, the thoughtful eldest at 12, Jasper, a pragmatic 10-year-old with an edge of skepticism, Lavinia, gentle at 7 with quiet assurance, and Lil Hugh, a curious 5-year-old whose wide eyes resonated with wonder. All fell silent as he opened the door. There, standing beneath the sodden sky, was a lean young man with a drab, mud-smeared coat and a serious look etched on his face. His eyes, rimmed by the streaks of rain, met Nathaniel's with an unreadable expression. "I'm Orrin," The stranger said simply, his voice low and measured, carrying an accent of the backcountry that struck both caution and familiarity. "I come from the far side of these trails with news that might burden you." He held out a folded slip of paper, damp and almost illegible beneath the pattering rain, as if it had been written in haste and delivered against nature's protest. Nathaniel frowned as he accepted the paper with gripped resolve, the sound of the storm seemingly receding into a tense silence for just a moment. "What news do you bring?" he asked, voice rumbling like distant thunder. Orrin's gaze swept over the gathered faces inside. "It seems that there is unrest stirring among the claimants of these lands. I've heard tell from those who roam the border that a rival faction, a menacing force promising to reclaim certain tracts for a long-time debtor, and perhaps even aligning with the disgraced husband of a woman who once carried shame, moves with purpose. In other words," Orrin paused, his eyes darkening, "the dispute over this land is far from settled, and there's whisper that your absent tormentor might not have abandoned you entirely." Seraphine's pulse quickened at the words. Though her voice had been hoarse from fear and neglect, she managed to speak. "Are you say he is still out there?" Her tone held a tremor of both terror and the nascent spark of defiance. Orrin inclined his head slowly. "I cannot say for certain, but the signs are clear. Tracks have been found near the old boundary, and word travels fast in these parts. I advise caution." His words, though sparse, carried the weight of a promise that nothing would be left unturned. Inside, the tension mounted. Nathaniel gathered the paper and studied its contents by the flickering glow of the lantern. The message, penned in hurried hand, spoke of disputed rights and rival claims, and hinted that the man responsible for her ordeal, her husband, whose pride had condemned her, might have allies determined to reclaim what they believed was theirs by force. Though the paper's markings were rough, the implication was stark. The past was not done with her yet, and the threat of retribution loomed like a storm cloud over an already troubled horizon. In an effort to steady her nerves, Seraphine rose from her seat, though every muscle in her still ached from the horror of her burial and the cruelty inflicted upon her. A steely glint had begun to illuminate her eyes, a sign of her burgeoning resolve to reclaim her dignity and forge a future beyond her imposed shame. I will not be a victim forever," she declared, her voice soft yet imbued with determination. "I must find my strength here." Nathaniel nodded, his face a visage of compassionate resolve. "You are safe here, and you are welcome among us." His words, though gentle, carried an undercurrent of solemn promise, the promise of a new life built on trust rather than cruelty, on community rather than isolation. As the storm raged outside, the homestead settled into an uneasy lull. The children, though young, demonstrated surprising resilience. Beauregard, with mature concern, helped reassure Jasper as they huddled by a small oil lamp, while Lavinia chattered softly to little Hugh, whose curiosity shone even to the fear of the unknown. The family began its tentative routines, as if to defy the chaos brought by the relentless weather and the dark tidings of Orrin's message. In the midst of this quiet determination, Nathaniel turned to Seraphine, his eyes reflecting a sorrowful past and a hope for redemption. He removed from his pocket a small, worn piece of paper, a cherished fragment left by his late wife. The paper, with faded words that spoke of dreams to build a home of warmth and unity, had been hidden for years amidst the hardships of his solitary existence. "This was her wish," Nathaniel said in a low, gruff whisper, offering the keepsake to Seraphine. "I've carried it in my heart all these years, and I believe it may now help us build something better together." Seraphine accepted it tentatively, feeling the gentle weight of shared grief and the promise of a future unburdened by the pain of the past. In that moment, as the warmth of the makeshift fire mingled with the chill of the storm outside, a subtle yet profound bond began to forge, a bond built on the scars of lost love and the determination to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Yet, even as the homestead's denizens found solace in each other's quiet companionship, the external threat loomed ever closer. The storm's fury did not cease, but instead shifted its course. The rain intensified, slamming against the homestead's patched walls, while winds howled and caused a tin roof to creak under nature's relentless assault. Amid the cacophony of nature's anger, another sign of trouble emerged. Fresh tracks of men, distinct in their deep, treaded impressions, were spotted in the muddy ground near the back of the homestead. Jasper, barely 10 and already perceptive, pointed at the ground with wide eyes. "Look," he exclaimed, his voice quivered with a mixture of fear and childish bravery. "There are prints here that don't belong to any of us." His words, innocent yet piercing, forced a gathered group to confront the reality that the specter of her husband's allies, or perhaps new foes, had not vanished. Nathaniel's face grew grim as he knelt to examine the tracks. "It appears we have company," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. The implications were clear. The land around the homestead was not yet secure, and the past threatened to intrude once more into fragile sanctuary they were slowly building. Seraphine's heart pounded as a chill of new fear mingled with the lingering hope that had taken root among them. "What do these tracks mean?" she asked in a barely audible tone, her eyes searching Nathaniel for answers that would bring both clarity and comfort. Before Nathaniel could reply, a sudden clap of thunder split the air and a flash of lightning illuminated the outpost. In that brief, brilliant moment, the glistening tracks on the damp earth seemed to form a clear path leading toward the barn, a path that might well be trodden by those who sought to reclaim or punish her. The sight sent a jolt of terror through the assembled community. The storm, now a furious symphony of rain and wind, seemed to echo the deep emotions that surged within each soul, a cacophony of nature's wrath mingled with the fearful whispers of fate. As the thunder receded into a mournful rumble, all eyes turned to the back door, where a low, insistent sound began anew, a soft knocking, as if done in cautious malice. In that charged moment, when hope and dread balanced on a knife's edge, Seraphine and Nathaniel exchanged one last determined glance. Behind them, the children huddled close, their expressions a mixture of innocence and steely resolve. With the storm still raging and the tracks ominously clear, the homestead's fragile peace was once again threatened by forces unseen but palpably near. And so, as the door's knock echoed to the storm-darkened hall, a call that promised either salvation or further despair, the fate of this troubled refuge and of the young woman whose life had been marred by cruelty hung suspended in a fragile, tear-stained moment. The second knock at the back door still echoed in the tense silence of the homestead, while the storm, though weakening, had left its mark on the land. Heavy drops had battered the patched windows and strewn debris along the wooden walkways. In the dim lantern glow of the common room, Seraphine's eyes, still haunted by memories of her forced burial and the cruelty of her past, fixed on Nathaniel as he slowly rose to answer the persistent rapping. Outside, the wind whispered through rain-slashed pines and the sodden earth shuddered under a sky heavy with unshed clouds. Nathaniel, steady despite grief etched in every line of his weathered face, crossed the doorway. He pulled it open cautiously, revealing a lean, rugged figure crouched at the threshold. The stranger's face was partially obscured by the brim of a worn hat and by swirling droplets of rain. His eyes, sharp and intense, flicked over Nathaniel and then landed on Seraphine, as if assessing the vulnerability of those sheltered inside. "I am Levi," the man said in a low, gravelly tone, his words blending with the murmur of the receding storm. "I come with a message and a warning." He lifted a gloved hand to reveal a damp, crumpled slip of paper clutched tightly within. The paper bore hastily scrawled words in a seal unfamiliar to the homestead's occupants. It mentioned disputed land rights and alluded to actions taken by a rival faction closely associated with Seraphine's absent husband. For a long, waited moment, Nathaniel and Seraphine exchanged silent glances. The presence of Levi, whose motives were as murky as the rain-darkened horizon, deepened the sense of unrest. The message was clear. There were those who claimed rights to this land by inheritance and by force, and they might be allied with the very man who had condemned Seraphine to a life of degradation. Inside the cabin, the four children huddled uneasily. Beauregard's thoughtful eyes met Jasper's skeptical gaze, while Lavinia's gentle expression mingled with Hugh's curious wonder. Their silence spoke of a shared understanding that the fragile haven they had built was now under threat. Nathaniel invited Levi into the room, but kept a measured distance. "Speak plainly," he said, voice low and resolute. "What do you bring?" Levi's gaze shifted slowly over the assembled faces before he began. "This paper comes from a man known in these parts as Forbes, a rival claimant whose family has long contested these lands. I was sent to deliver his ultimatum: yield the homestead and its claim to the disputed acreage, or face the consequences. I have seen his men around the outer trails. They are preparing to make their move soon." A heavy silence fell over the room as Levi's words sank in. For Seraphine, the mention of her husband's name, or even a hint of his allies, was a piercing reminder of her past torment. Though she fought back the tremor of fear that rippled through her, her eyes revealed a steely resolve that grew with every word. "And what if we refuse?" she asked, voice quiet but filled with latent power. Levi hesitated, as if weighing his answer. "Then I was ordered to advise you to prepare for conflict," he replied. "I am not here to fight for you, only to deliver the message. But mark my words, the rival claim will not be allowed to erode the legacy of those who dwell on this land." His tone, ambiguous and hard-edged, left his true allegiance uncertain. Was he an unwilling messenger, or a man whose heart had hardened to loyalty with his employer? Nathaniel's eyes narrowed as he regarded Levi. Memories of his own painful losses, the silenced dreams of his late wife, and the bitter scars of independence stolen, rose within him. "You bring threats, not hope," he said slowly. "Yet, if this is true, we must stand united." He looked to Seraphine, whose gaze was fixed, unwavering, as if daring fate to break her spirit. Outside, the storm's wrath had lessened, yet its power was still evident in the floodwaters that now meandered along a low-lying path behind the barn, and in the damaged fences that sagged under the burden of nature's fury. The homestead's resilience had been tested by the night's elements, and its battered walls bore silent testament to previous struggles. In an effort to regain some control, Seraphine rose from her seat and approached a smoldering corner where a modest fire still glowed with flickering determination. With careful, deliberate movements that betrayed both the lingering pain of her past and the burgeoning strength within, she retrieved a heavy iron fire poker from a worn leather pouch. "I will not cower," she declared softly, her voice steady despite the flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. "I will work with all of you to secure our home. We must fix what the storm has broken and strengthen our defenses against those who would take our land." Her words, quiet yet resonant, stirred the assembled community. The children watched with wide, uncertain eyes, and even Levi's stoic expression softened as he recognized a spark of courage in her tone. Nathaniel placed a firm, reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Your courage gives us hope," he said gently. "My late wife once dreamed of a homestead where compassion and resilience would be the foundation. I believe that dream may yet be realized." As they spoke, the sound of soft, measured footfalls was heard at the rear of the cabin, a set of tracks fresh in the mud, distinct from those left by the storm. Jasper, ever the skeptical one, peered anxiously out the battered door. "There are fresh tracks leading toward the barn," he announced in a trembling voice, as if someone has come stake a claim in our very midst. A hush fell over the room once more as all eyes turned to the door. The knock had already subsided, but the unmistakable impression of additional footsteps in the rain-soaked earth signaled that the threat was not yet silenced. With the tension mounting and the storm still roaring its final ballad outside, Nathaniel stepped toward the door, hesitating only a moment longer before opening it. Outside, barely visible beneath a shroud of mist and lingering rain, a lone figure stood. Cloaked in a dark, patched duster and with eyes obscured by the hood, the new arrival, who had not been seen before, appeared to be a neighbor from a distant part of the county. His presence was subtle, yet charged with implication. "I bring further word from the west," he said, his voice low and grave. "There is rumor that Forbes's claim is only the beginning. A deeper feud runs beneath the surface, one that ties even to dishonor those who cast aside a woman for her inability to bear children. His gaze finally met Seraphine's, a flicker of something unreadable, anger, sorrow, or perhaps a vow for vengeance, dancing in his dark eyes. For a long, suspended moment, Seraphine and the stranger locked eyes. In that silent exchange, the weight of centuries of patriarchal judgment, of land and lineage stolen by those in power, pressed down upon her. Yet within her, a fierce flame of defiance began to kindle, propelled by the bitter knowledge of her past and the glimmer of hope nurtured by Nathaniel's kindness. "Who are you?" she demanded, voice barely rising above the muted roar of the receding storm. The strangers had fell back slightly, revealing a gaunt, weather-beaten face. "I am Caleb," he replied, his tone a mixture of apology and determination. "I come bearing a message from those who have long suffered under the weight of false claims. Your husband's cruelty was but one chapter in a greater tale, one that threatens to swallow us all if we do not act." His words, stark and imbued with hard-won bitterness, sent a ripple through the room. Before anyone could respond further, another flash of lightning illuminated the rain-slick ground outside. In that brief, electric moment, fresh tracks were seen leading toward the barn, a sign that another set of intruders, or perhaps supporters of the rival claim, had arrived. The sound of approaching footsteps merged with the murmur of the storm, and the outpost's fragile unity trembled under the tension of impending confrontation. Nathaniel stepped between Caleb and the gathered crowd, his voice firm. "We will not be dictated by whispers and rumors. We have built this home with sweat and sacrifice, and we stand together against any who seek to tear it apart." His declaration, both an affirmation of the shared dream and a challenge to the forces gathering outside, seemed to galvanize those present. As the rain began to relent and the sound of the storm faded into a murmur, Caleb's expression grew ever more intense. "This is only the start," he intoned. "The land remembers its wrongs, and the descendants of the rejected will not rest until what is theirs is reclaimed." His final words hung in the air, a portent that the feud was not merely about a piece of land. It was about reclaiming a legacy marred by injustice. In that charged moment, as the new tracks outside grew even more distinct in the softened earth, a fresh knock resounded at the door, a knock that promised further secrets, and a looming decision that would test the mettle of those who had gathered. Seraphine's eyes, burning with newfound resolve, met Nathaniel's. They both knew that what lay beyond that door might either unite them in common cause or shatter their fragile hope. As the sound of that knock faded into the stillness of the uncertain morn, the community was left suspended on the brink of a reckoning born of old grievances, rival claims, and a woman's fierce desire to forge her own destiny. With the storm now a distant whisper and the rain-slicked plains glistening under fragile light of dawn, every heart in the outpost pounded in silent unison, awaiting the final verdict of fate. The final knock shattered the fragile dawn like a mournful bell, its echo lingering amid the storm's fading fury. In that charged moment, as the Wyoming sky began to break with a tentative glow, Seraphine's pulse quickened, and she knew that the fate of her new life and the legacy of this battered homestead rested on what would follow. Outside on the rain-soaked porch, Nathaniel and his children gathered in quiet anticipation, their eyes straining towards a darkened horizon where the threat had once loomed. With steady determination, Nathaniel opened a door to reveal a small group of men, the unmistakable insignia on their patched caps bearing the mark of Forbes's claim. Their leader, a gaunt man with eyes as cold as the mountain air, stepped forward and spoke in clipped, measured tones. "We come on behalf of the rightful owner," he declared. "This land is claimed, and by our orders, you are to yield all defenses immediately." His words rippled across the gathered family, and for a moment, the remnant echo of the storm and the scent of wet earth mingled with the bitter taste of old rivalries. Seraphine's heart pounded as she met the man's steely gaze. The injustice of her past, of being condemned for her own barren fate, surged within her as if to forge a new purpose. "I will yield nothing to a man who would punish a life for its infirmity," she replied, voice low but unwavering, her eyes burning with a fierce light. "I belong here with my chosen family." Her words, laden with both defiance and quiet dignity, resonated in the hush that fell over the assembled group. Nathaniel stepped forward, his voice echoing across the rain-spattered porch. "We have already suffered enough," he declared. "This homestead, though scarred by storms and ancient grudges, is our sanctuary. Our loyalty is to our own, to those who built their lives with sweat, hope, and unity. We will not allow old hate to tear us apart again." His tone, resolute and kind, embraced the ideals he had long fought for and now shared with Seraphine. For a long, charged moment, the rival men hesitated. The leader's eyes flickered uncertainly as he scanned the determined faces gathered on the porch, where even the children, Beauregard with thoughtful intelligence, Jasper with a cautious frown, gentle Lavinia, and little Hugh, wide-eyed in curious wonder, stood united. Their small forms, though slight against the vast Wyoming expanse, embodied the strength of a future built on togetherness and resilience. Before the tension could resolve fully, a sudden, piercing crack of thunder cascaded over plains, and with it came a violent gust of wind that knocked over a section of the repaired fence. The sudden collapse produced both a physical barrier and an ominous symbol of impermanence, as water pooled in the broken gaps, reflecting the storm's last sullen tears. In the confusion of the noise, one of Forbes's men lunged forward, but Nathaniel was swift. With a practiced motion, he raised his rifle, its cold metal gleaming in the fleeting light, and fired a warning shot that echoed like fate's decree across the soggy air. The flash of the muzzle and the resounding report drove the rival claimants' group back a few paces. The gaunt leader hissed, "This is not over," his voice barely audible over the dying storm. But as his men retreated slowly, carrying their claim and pride like wounded animals back into the dark outlines of distant ridges, a murmur of relief swept through Nathaniel's homestead. Inside the shelter, amid the damp remnants of the storm, Seraphine exhaled slowly as if releasing the last of her old torment. In a quiet moment of shared understanding, she approached Nathaniel, her eyes glistening in the soft torchlight that danced along the patched walls. "I have spent too many nights in darkness," she whispered, her voice a mix of vulnerability and burgeoning strength. "Your kindness and the hope you have given me have shown me that I can forge a future on my own terms. No man's cruelty can define who I am." Her declaration, simple yet profound, ignited a spark in those gathered, a spark of defiance against every injustice born of patriarchal cruelty and ancient feuds. Nathaniel nodded, the deep lines of his face softening as he recalled the memory of his lost beloved, a woman whose dreams of a thriving homestead had been extinguished by bitterness, leaving him to raise his children in solitude. "We may not have everything," he said quietly, "but here, among these patched fences and rain-worn fields, we have the power to build a new legacy, a legacy of compassion and unity. Our home, like the land itself, endures through hardship." His words, resonant and hopeful, wove a tapestry of promises that stretched far beyond the present moment. As the rival men faded into the distance, the storm softened into a gentle drizzle that washed over the outpost like a whispered benediction. The homestead's workers began to move with renewed purpose, rebuilding fences, mending broken boards, and clearing the tumbled debris, all under the watchful yet determined eyes of the community. The steady cadence of their work lent a quiet symphony to the morning, a song of human spirit rising defiantly against the crucible of fate. The children, no longer hidden away in his or huddles, began to take part in the rebuilding efforts. Beauregard, with wisdom beyond his years, offered measured suggestions, while Jasper's skeptical glance gradually softened into a cautious smile as he saw the unity among the adults. Lavinia's gentle touch and little Hugh's curiosity became symbols of hope, tiny reminders that from struggle, new life could emerge. Later that day, as the storm's memory lingered in the scent of damp earth and the soft patter of renewed rain on tin roofs, the community gathered around a modest fire pit outside the rebuilt barn. In this circle of shared resilience and hope, Nathaniel produced a small hand-woven charm, crafted by his late wife, a relic of a dream that had once promised warmth and family. He presented it delicately to Seraphine. "Take this," he said, as a reminder that even in our darkest moments, love endures, and we can choose a legacy of hope over despair. Seraphine clutched the charm with a small, defiant smile, knowing that though her past had been steeped in cruelty, the future was yet unwritten. As dusk approached and the sky turned from stormy gray to the deep indigo hues of night, the outpost stood as a testament to the community's strength. The air, though still cool, held the promise of a new dawn where resilience and compassion would prevail. In the midst of it all, Seraphine stood beside Nathaniel and the children, her eyes lifted to the horizon where distant figures on horseback roamed. A subtle reminder that while threats might yet linger in the wild expanses of Wyoming, they were now met with unwavering unity. In that reflective, open-ended moment, Seraphine surveyed the land that had once been the stage of her torment. Now it was transformed by blood, sweat, and shared hope. "We have reclaimed our destiny," she murmured, her voice carrying softly over the gentle lapping of water on mud-slick trails. "Let our home be a beacon for all who have been cast aside, a sanctuary built from the remnant of our pain and our greatest dreams." Nathaniel's eyes shone with quiet pride as he placed a reassuring hand upon her shoulder. "Our journey does not end here," he observed, his tone both somber and filled with promise. "Each dawn we greet is a testament to our strength, and though the road ahead may be long and fraught with challenges, our resolve binds us together, now and for all our tomorrows." As the firelight flickered like hope across the assembled faces, the community settled into a reflective silence. The storm had passed, the damaged fences were being repaired, and slowly, the hostile echoes of the past were being replaced by the gentle murmur of a future built on love and shared purpose. In the distance, the plains shimmered under a dawn breaking like a vow, an endless horizon that hinted at both faded struggles and the promise of new beginnings. Yet, even in this moment of hard-won peace, a soft, persistent sound echoed from the far ridge, a steady clatter of hooves and murmured voices, as if a new chapter challenge was already on its way. The warning was subtle, but its presence was undeniable, a reminder that in the wild expanse of the Wyoming Badlands, hope and hardship were eternally intertwined. Seraphine looked out toward the distant silhouettes, her heart both heavy and unbowed. "What will tomorrow bring?" she whispered, her voice mingling with the cool night air. "Yet, I no longer fear what lies beyond that horizon. We have chosen to stand together, and in our unity, we will shape our future." Nathaniel nodded, his gaze fixed firmly on the path ahead. "Let it be so," he replied, his voice echoing like a promise in quiet. "Our legacy starts with this very moment, and though the world may test us again, our spirit will endure." And so, as the stars glinted softly over rain-cleared sagebrush and the wind whispered of a new day's potential, the bonds forged in the crucible of loss and renewal held fast. The homestead, once marred by cruelty and despair, now stood as a sanctuary of chosen family and unyielding hope. Its future is open and infinite as the Wyoming sky itself. What new challenges will the coming dawn unveil?